Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth annual Strategic Land Debate hosted by Hogan Lovells and the International Building Press. The questions of how many new homes we need, where we should build them, and how we can ensure effective delivery are subjects which continue to dominate both the social and political agendas, and I think they provide probably almost endless opportunities for debate. We're fortunate to be joined this evening by an extremely impressive group of individuals who all have very close involvement in this sector. Our chair will be known to all of you. Peter Bill is a columnist with the Evening Standard and for 11 years was the editor of the Estates Gazette. And he is also the author of the recently published book, Planet Property, which details the inner workings of the UK commercial property, residential development and rental markets. So who better than Peter to chair tonight's discussions? Emma Cariaga is a residential development director at British Land, overseeing the residential element of a number of the company's development projects. Before joining British Land, Emma was with Land Securities, spending 7 years managing a number of residential developments, in particular the Ebbsfleet Valley project. Bill Hughes is Managing Director of Legal and General Property. Bill joined Legal and General in 2007, having previously held the position of UK Head of Real Estate at Deutsche Bank's Real Estate Fund Management business. Legal and General, of course, have made no secret of their aspirations in the residential market, and very topically, Bill was a commissioner on the recently published Lyons report, of which no doubt we will hear a little bit later. Wahid Nazir is Birmingham City Council's Director of Planning and Regeneration. He spent more than 10 years at that authority and has overseen its far-reaching big city plan and the Birmingham Curzon HS2 master plan. And with Wahid's control of the planning, regeneration and housing teams at Birmingham, by his own admission, I think he's pretty much in charge of where any growth takes place in Birmingham. And finally, Nick Taylor is the UK Head of Planning at Carter Jonas LLP. Nick's a chartered town planner and development surveyor with over 25 years' experience gained across most of the development sectors, including residential. And prior to joining Carter Jonas in 2011, Nick worked at CBRE and Drivers Jonas Deloitte. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us this evening for what promises to be a lively debate, and I hope that you'll be able to stay on afterwards to join us for some drinks up on the floor that we've just come from. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everybody, and welcome from me. The structure of this evening is that we'll probably have an opening statement from each of the panellists, which we've talked through briefly, and then we will move into a discussion for 10-15 minutes on that, and then hopefully we get finished by about 6:30, 20 to 7. We'll then open the floor to questions, which I would welcome. So if you can think of anything particularly nasty that you would like to ask any of them, please make them as pointed as possible. Not terribly keen on statements, very keen on questions. Some of these guys will have the answers for you, I'm sure. We will be talking about the Green Belt to start with, and garden cities and PRS, and then we might move on into HS2 to talk about the impact of that and how it might work out, and then we'll throw it open. So that's where we go. We've agreed an order of batting with the team here, and Wahid's going to open the batting. And the reason he's opening the batting is partly to do with the headline of this debate tonight, is whose land is it anyway? And Wahid is sequestering green belt land all over Birmingham in the next few weeks, he tells me, as some part of public review. Could you just tell us a little bit about what's going on and why you're doing this, and is it really green at all, this land?
Okay. Just to clarify, because I'm going through a public inquiry as we speak, that we're not advocating all massive releases of green belts in Birmingham. Like most regional cities, the city is facing increasing pressure to meet housing growth as well as economic growth for land. And as a consequence, land supply within the city is very short. Birmingham as a city has very small land of greenbelt land, principally to the north of the city. And as we started to move forward to looking to how we deal with our housing growth, we found that we actually had to deliver anything between 80,000 new homes up to 125,000 new homes by 2031. And when we looked at all of our brownfield land within the city, we've only got capacity to meet 45,000 homes within brownfield land within the city. And that's looking at various densities from 40 hectares up to 120 hectares per home per hectare. So we then actually advocated to release the grain belt to the north of the city for around 6,000 homes to create a sustainable urban extension. We reviewed the green belt, and part of the green belt we thought was very high-valued landscaped green belt and served a purpose for defensible boundary, and others were nice open fields which served a purpose many years ago, but really in the growing pressure, we felt we should advocate for release of green belt, and we're now going through an inquiry and hopefully the inspector sides with us to release that, to create the capacity in the market. We're still short 30-odd thousand homes to meet our requirement, and now we're working with joining local authorities to look at releasing their green belt to support that growth, which I'm sure you can imagine is an incredibly difficult conversation to have with joining partners, not to release green belt for their own needs, but release green belt for an adjoining authority's needs.
When you get your super mayor, though, you'll be able to bully them into it, won't you?
Well, hopefully when we have a super mayor, we'll hopefully have an agreement on how we meet the housing needs across the housing needs area.
Okay, thank you. I think Nick comes naturally next. Nick's is an expert on the green belt and would like to talk about how do the rules that govern it at the moment need to be reviewed. Is it too emotive a name? Should we call it something else? What practical steps could be taken, Nick, that wouldn't take 10 years to sort out to try and diffuse the green belt issue and to get some more put into the housing side if necessary?
I think we are stuck with the term, and you're absolutely right, it's incredibly emotive. Nothing guaranteed to make the Reader Telegraph have a heart attack at breakfast when they sort of see the headlines of the green belt being under review and attack. I think the solution's pretty clear. I think it needs the sort of vision that Birmingham's showing at the moment to just to face up to the problem it has to deliver that level of housing growth.
How do you make a recalcitrant county council or county town in the south do that?
I think the difficulty until recently, which is sort of part of what I'll go into, is that we've had planning by appeal since the NPPF came in, whereby if local authorities weren't positive, weren't proactive, they would lose an appeal because the ace card in the pack post NPPF was always 5-year housing land supply, and it would be put on the table again and again and again. It was the winning hand, and local authorities were suddenly finding they were getting housing development in areas that they perhaps didn't want it, and I think that's bringing them round to having to plan positively. I think the challenge, as Wahid explained, is where if you can't fit it in your boundaries because you're an urban area and you're constrained, and that's very relevant to London, what happens in the suburbs, what happens in adjoining boroughs and districts, the duty to cooperate.
Well, that's turned into a nonsense, hasn't it? That duty to cooperate?
It works in some places, but in others, again, as Wahid said, for the political reasons, you're saying to your electorate, I'm taking X thousand homes from that borough, but we don't get the benefit, we only get the pain. And at the next local election, perhaps that administration is shown the door because they haven't delivered what the community wants. So I'm afraid that is one of the flaws in our current system.
What's the solution?
Regional planning. You have to go back to regional planning. You have to go back to
John Prescott.
You have to go back to the Stalinist system that Pickles despises of saying, we've been through examination, you have to go back to regional spatial strategies, you have to look at an economic region, a social region, and say, these are the needs of that whole region, and then when you get into difficulties of an urban area being constrained, how do you meet those needs across the area? You take that macro view and then you take it down to the micro and you apply it at individual levels. And at that point, it's easy to say, wasn't my fault, these targets have been imposed upon me. But it seems to me that's the only way you'll be able to
So we've
get
had five wasted years of Tory localism then.
Pretty much. Parts of localism work, again I'll touch on some examples where I think it does work, but I think if you are, we remain a nation of NIMBYs. It's a simple truth, and I think that the challenge there is there will be some instances where people will embrace growth, but all the evidence of the number of housing units taken out of development plans immediately post the abolition of the RSS is evidence of people don't vote for growth. There are a few instances where they do, but it needs brave leadership, and you don't always get that, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, we'll bring back John Prescott, I think. Emma, the other solution, of course, is to build 10 garden cities all around Britain, isn't it, really? Isn't that what we should do?
Possibly. I think before I sort of talk about garden cities, I suppose the one thing that seems to be ever more certain is that housing seems to be a cross-party issue. And there is, for once, first time I think in my working life, it's high enough up the political agenda across all parties that you might hope that there is some scope for a solution. And I think garden cities are an interesting, potentially cross-party vote winner.
Are they misnamed? Is it a silly idea?
I think they are, but I think deliberately so, because with garden cities there's a certain nostalgic...
sounds better than eco towns, doesn't it?
It sounds better than new towns and new settlements, and you know, the issue is, are we going to continue to focus on an urban extension type approach to strategic land, or are we going to take the brave new step of a new settlement? And garden cities are possibly a way of softening the pill of something that's otherwise badged an eco town or new settlement. I am pro garden cities. I think there's a chance, just a chance anyway, that with it and with the branding and the, for want of a better expression, the sort of green ethos that comes with it, a chance of tackling some of the anti-development sentiment, potentially. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that's going to be the solution to our housing crisis. You know,
why isn't it going to be?
Well, because they are, by their very nature, not going to be many of them, and they will be in locations where undoubtedly land is at a premium, where infrastructure is lacking, and where there is a lot of preparatory work to get the show on the road. And we all know there are examples of big new settlements or garden cities where, you know, try as everyone might, and with all the political will and a willing developer, you're not going to see thousands and thousands of new homes being built overnight. It is one of a suite of tools, but it's by no means, you know, going to crack it.
I know you can't talk too much about it, but you could have built one down at Ebbsfleet, couldn't you, when you were working for Land Securities?
Well,
all the infrastructure was put in. Hundreds of millions was spent on the infrastructure there. The station has been built at Ebbsfleet, and it's just like the moonscape still.
Yeah, it is. And yet, even if they started building tomorrow, it's not going to produce more than 1,000 homes in a year or so. Yeah. And the scale of our need is way beyond, you know, accepting that a garden city can really make any decent inroads into it. It's a nice added tool to a toolkit of housing solutions, but it can't do it in any significant volume, and I worry that with all the political will, there's then going to become an over-reliance on them to solve the problem, and we all take our eyes off all those other
you could already
opportunities.
see the political imperative to announcing Ebbsfleet Garden City by the next election, can't you, coming?
Yeah, we'll talk about John Prescott. I mean, every housing minister since, you know, God knows when has relaunched developments like that, and that's because, you know, there is so little else out there for them to focus on.
Okay, all right, we'll come back to where we could put them on later, but just to finalise with Bill, who sat on the Lions Commission, which looked at housing demand. I wanted to talk to Bill about the private rented sector for a couple of minutes. It seems to be the topic of the day, or the topic of the month perhaps. This morning I was at a breakfast with M&G, who announced they were going to spend £1 billion of their investors' money in the next 3 to 5 years, which is approximately 4,000 houses in their PRS pipeline. They've started off very slowly and cautiously, as all funds do. There is now about £4 billion worth of promised fund money knocking around from about half a dozen different funds, and there is the promise, I think, this is from M&G, not from L&G, for another 6 or 7 funds to come into this market. Yet the Lions Commission suggested you wouldn't need to even spend that amount of money because all we need is about $8,500 a year, Bill. That seems quite a low number given the number of people coming into the sector. I know it's per year, but it still seems a low number. Why did you come up with 8,500?
Yeah, well, there's some science to it, but it's a little bit of a finger in the air in truth. I think the view on PRS that's embedded in that number is, whilst there's a lot of talk about investment in the private rented sector, in the end, if you believe in build to rent as opposed to buy to rent or some sort of conversion of owner occupation, you have got to get through the planning system, you have to build the buildings, you have to get them let up and let, stabilised. And, you know, if M&G is saying $1 billion over 3 to 5 years and there's half a dozen doing something similar, then there will be, even in their activity, probably something of an S-shaped curve. They'll start slowly and they'll build up momentum. So it's partly to do with the fact that we're looking for a new sort of product for the UK that takes some time to procure.
Okay. I noticed that the councils are supposed to calculate their PRS requirements. Is that useful or not useful? Does it matter whether they do or not?
Well,
Does it help you?
I mean, I'm in the camp of thinking that being obsessed with PRS is certainly only part of the story, because a mix of tenures, social housing, affordable rental, premium rental, build to sell, old age retirement, retirement living, all of those things are important. So I think at a local authority level, in terms of housing supply and thinking about that, of course demand matters, but at the end of the day, there needs to be some careful thinking across all forms of tenure to end up with a sensibly diverse mix, because otherwise you end up with a lopsided outcome. We were talking this morning actually at a different event about the extent to which London is being tempted into delivering houses that are not affordable in the build-to-sell sector. And I think there is a danger there at an urban level that you end up with profit-taking rather than thinking about the entirety of what the picture looks like and some sort of community approach and some sort of balance from a societal point of view. And grand words, but I think that matters.
Okay. What do you think, from with a local authority hat on, about PRS and people coming to you and wanting to do it? Do you think it's a good thing, bad thing?
We think it's an important contribution to the overall housing offer. Most regional cities have a requirement existing of private rented sector in the market of around 20%. It's a very different product to a build to rent. But as we're seeing, particularly in city centre locations, the real demand for build to rent developing. And you take Birmingham as an example, since 2008 up until 2013, the build for rent, the private rented sector in the city centre grew by 20%, increase in rental values, which is the highest growth in any of the uses within the city at that time. We're seeing a real interest in private rented sector. We've got a couple of schemes just come in, over 1,500 homes within the city. I mean, you said the figure of 8,000 seems quite low, but actually trying to get that level of momentum progressing across all the UK, I think is still incredibly challenging. The challenge for us is not about actually defining the need, it's actually how do you negotiate the position. We still got through the planning process a lot of challenges. If you look at a private rented sector scheme, the viability generally is a lot tighter, and therefore when you're negotiating Section 106 agreements, you would be seeking to negotiate a lower sum of Section 106 in order to support the scheme to move forward. If that was for a for sale scheme, obviously you'd be getting a higher level of Section 106 contribution.
So you don't get as big a bribe?
I would say it's a bribe. I think it's a contribution to ensuring the education infrastructure or the roads is actually suitable to support the development. And the challenge at the moment is how do you still support the sector move forward while still not losing full control of the development itself.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's enough on the opening statements. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to turn now to the general topic on HS2, and then we'll move things open. Again, it's the topic of the day, and it's coming into Birmingham, and I think Waheed is planning feverishly for its arrival now, as opposed to worrying about whether it's going to arrive or not. It's branching on up into the north of England. It's already causing, it's a sort of litmus for the look at the regional authorities up in that area and things like that. But I think the big thing is we were talking about it earlier, there seems to be little happening, or I thought there was little happening, on who shares in the booty of the uplift in land values. And this is not compensation, I'm not talking about compensation, I'm talking about people with land around the stations and around Birmingham where the stations are going to be. Who gets that money? And I wrote something tongue-in-cheek in the Standard last week saying if only they were more generous to the landowners, give them 10 times the agricultural land value instead of the agricultural land value, and take 200,000 an acre instead of 240,000 an acre. Well, what's wrong with that, and wouldn't it make life easier? But when he said this is actually happening now, this is being discussed as we speak in select committee, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean,
Just give us a view of what the arguments are.
okay, I mean, in simple, I mean, the hybrid bill is going through the Parliamentary Select Committee, and some of the landowners have made a very clear case that while High Speed 2 seeks to acquire the land around the station for the station's purposes and wider, they are seeking that the land that's not used for the station is returned back at the current value, or it's all done on a hire agreement, because actually they don't feel they should lose the land value. Obviously, High Speed 2 have a very different view, which is that they would acquire all of the land. Once the station is built, they will then sell the site, remaining land they don't need, at market value at that time, which could be, in reality, the difference of being £1 million an acre post the station completed to what could be 20,000 an acre today. And I think that debate has started, and evidence has been given by landowners to the Parliamentary Select Committee, and it will be a debate that continues. I mean, to be frank, it's been a debate that the government's had, not just around High Speed 2, it's actually been extended to a debate around Greenbelt and who actually captures uplifting land value, and there was a whole debate for many of you seen around land auctions, and whether actually how do you capture uplifting land value for the benefit of the public's.
How far, I mean, perhaps some of the audience know this, but how far around the proposed stations are they allowed to grab land?
It's quite extensive around the station, but there also now there's discussions around the regeneration company and the National Regeneration Company, which currently has powers for CPO purposes to unlock regeneration. So technically, they could actually acquire land outside the hybrid bill in order to unlock regeneration and then also still capture that uplift in value.
Could they go as far as to say, here we want to build a city?
Well, I mean, if you take the example of Birmingham, we have done a master plan around the High Speed 2 station coming into the city centre. We've identified 141 hectares of land, which we feel can improve by increased development activity, by densities and uses. You could see the line that actually affects High Speed 2 is probably no more than 10 acres. But it's 141 hectares we think will grow in uplift in value and in terms of uses.
Have you worked out how much the uplift might be?
We have some indications, and we are working through a business case which talks about how do you capture some of that uplift in land value, and that's not just through acquiring it, but also things like localised tariffs and sales.
So will you be generous to the landowners, or will you just CPO them?
I have no intention of CPOing, which is being recorded, so I'll be clear on record. We have no intention of CPOing them, and we feel that working with the market to deliver the growth is the way forward.
Okay. Well, how much do you think the uplift in land values is?
It varies. If you're talking about Greenbelt, and if you take the example of UKC, where we have a station out by the airport, agricultural land values around 25,000 an acre. By the time you finish the station, you could be getting close to 1.5 million per acre. So very, very. It's a lot more, lot more than your 275,000.
Yeah, I was just being cautious when I wrote that. So, and who gets that then? Who's going to get all that?
At the moment, it's not. The landowners are planning they should get it, and I suspect somebody will be at High Speed 2 assuming they may get it, and that's going to be debated out for months to come, I think.
It just seems very important that this is sorted out, doesn't it? It seems incredible that we got to this point and it's not been.
I mean, absolutely. Birmingham as a city owns land in Solihull, so we're very clear that we should continue to own that land that we own, which is agricultural, and we should train the uplift in land value. So, as you can see, why I'm so sympathetic to the development industry.
You're just another developer, really. Emma, can I just ask you about whether it would be? Do you think it would be viable to build a new town or a new city or two on the route of HS2?
I think when you're looking at a national infrastructure project like that, it seems extraordinary to me that it's left to individual local authorities actually to make their own regen cases at various points along the route. And whilst I'm not advocating regional planning or national planning, I'm sure that day's well long gone. But it does really beg for a national plan about when you have national infrastructure projects where the appropriate places for growth are. The issue about land value, I think, look, it's a debate that'll rage forever. But if you look at the garden cities and suburbs that we all know and love, they were all built off very low land values. That's why they economically worked and why the volumes of house building came forward in at the rate that it did. The difficulty we have often now is that sites get allocated in local plans, the land value goes through the roof, and the economics constrain the supply. And so there is definitely a trick somehow, depending on regardless of who gets it and how you make it work.
He's a very clever chap,
Yeah.
David Higgins. What advice would you give to him? Can't he just grab a load of land around a station and say we're going to build a new city? It sounds like he can, according to Wahid.
Well, potentially if the
Who's
region
now the Oracle.
authority has the... Wahid will know, but I think the important point is that it needs a grown-up debate. We've got a national rail line transcending through Great Britain. Where is the right place for growth along that line? And local authorities and national government need to have a role in that. I mean, the Thames Gateway is a really good example. It wasn't incumbent on Dartford and Gravesham and Medway to decide that there was a bit of that there was a Thames Gateway regeneration plan. It was a central government initiative in parallel with the HS1 line, and it strikes me that a similar type of approach and something of such significance needs to be adopted, I think, for something like HS2.
Oh, you're a strategic thinker. What would you do if you were in charge?
Look, I'm not as excited about these new cities as everyone else seems to be on the panel, but some of them will be required. And yeah, if you're going to invest huge amounts of capital in a major transportational infrastructure, it absolutely seems to me to be logical to think hard about the implications of that along the way. How many stops there are is a limitation, but where the train stops is connecting London and other cities, Birmingham and other cities to new locations. So absolutely it matters. And if there's one thing I'm sure is important here, is taking the pressure away from the southeast is what you really want to have happen rather than the opposite way around.
So north of Birmingham, really? Or just Birmingham?
No, I mean, we've been clear that the line has to continue up north to give us the economic benefits in Birmingham. It has to go to Leeds, it has to go to Manchester. This is a national project. This isn't London connection to Birmingham, and that's not how we've seen it. And I think the other issue that you referred to about some of the Garden cities, I would say, are slightly different in the sense that you've got the infrastructure with High Speed 2 at your doorstep already been invested in by government. So actually it gives you a substantial investment to start off with, where much of the garden cities, you're talking about putting all the infrastructure in off the land value itself, which is a slightly different ballgame.
Okay. Nick, you're God, and you have to redesign the hybrid bill for HS2. What have you put in it in order to get some of the money back from uplifting land values?
If I was God, I'd use the French system, which is you acquire land at its existing use value, and the state benefits from the uplift, and that pays for the infrastructure. Whether it's...
Didn't they pay... I thought they paid a little premium, no?
They pay a small premium, but in terms of the system, it totally takes away all that we're sort of debating here, whereby the state facilitates and the state benefits. And we sort of clumsily do it. We've tried all sorts of things, development land tax. We're now, with SIL, recovering some of it, but you don't recover all of it. And it's still...
It's a CPO system, actually, was it in France?
Yes, and it's they also have a much stricter land use zoning system than we have here, where you have, as I said earlier, the ability by planning by appeal to overturn land use designations. But it seems to me that that's the only way that you could make that level of transformational change. But I would add also, and I think the point about garden cities and this whole debate is, if we're building 100,000 homes a year short of our target, and do that for 10 years, then you're 1 million houses down. You're fiddling around the edges if you're saying, well, actually, we'll do some garden cities here or a little suburb over here. You're substantially short, and I think there is a need for a very mature debate about housing density, size of units, where you're building some of the smallest homes in Europe.
Aren't we building the homes are too small and the sites are too dense, basically, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that's another reason why communities are so resistant to development, because if you ask the audience, name good schemes where you go to recently of housing developments where you go, they are exemplar schemes which are well built. Dare I say they've got the right amount of car parking? Because you go to an estate now with new change car parking standards, there's cars everywhere because you can't control how many cars people have, but they'll just park them all over the place.
Yeah.
So you have these chaotic, high density, often poor quality schemes, and I think again that's a large part of the problem of persuading communities to embrace development because they know what's coming.
All too high density. I remember when it was 12 to the acre. What's it now? 40, 50,
30.
30.
Depending where you are. Well, so not London, but Wahid was saying they're planning 30 to 40 with their sustainable
just
urban
moved
extension.
out of a nightmare close where there was no parking. You try living in one of those closes where the planners dictated that there shouldn't be too many cars. They are a nightmare.
Yeah.
And they're all over Britain. And has it changed? No. Because there's more money being made out of selling houses than there are about selling car park places, basically, isn't it?
Not in London, perhaps, but
Just a couple of supplementaries then on the opening remarks. I can't see how we're going to get any closer to having who benefits from the uplift sorted out. Can anybody else?
I think for your point,
you're all saying bugger the people who own the land. You're all saying it.
I don't think I said that. Let me make that point clear. I did not. I don't concur with Nick's view about that. I mean, I think
that's only when I'm God. It's not when I think how it's now.
I think there's got to be a compromise. You're going to need the private sector to take some of the development risk. You've got to share the reward with the private sector. If you expect to take all the uplifting value, is the public sector going to take all the risk? No. So you have to share that value. And I think that your point you made earlier, there's got to be a compromise where you work with the private sector to share the reward and the risk. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to not see development take place.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sort of nearly done. I've got a couple of supplementaries if nobody wants to ask any questions, but I'd be welcome to have a few from the audience now. Anybody like to open the batting? Yes, sir. Just say who you are and who you probably like to answer.
Simon Slatford from Land Evolution Fund. So it's interesting, Emma's view, and it may be on land values, but with Crossrail 1, we obviously had King's Cross, Stratford City, all on stations, and they've obviously been quite a success and have really progressed. Obviously, Ebbsfleet didn't manage to get off the ground. Is that simply just a question the values weren't there at Ebbsfleet?
I think for if normal circumstances had applied, Ebbsfleet would have come forward, I think, earlier than it had. I think part of the reason why not just that site but the Thames Gateway in general hasn't really taken off despite the transport improvements was the Olympics. When that high-speed link was foreseen, there was clearly a stop at Stratford, but nothing like the inward investment story that then arose as a result of that. And that effectively sapped all the demand, commercial demand anyway, for office and retail and leisure that would otherwise have been delivered at the Thames Gateway. So I think it's probably just a question of timing. It will happen, and it's already happening. I think they're building houses there right now. And as and when the demand is saturated at King's Cross and then at Stratford, undoubtedly it moves down the line. So I think it's just a question of timing, but it really strengthens my view, I think, which is this is really long-term stuff. It's really slow in terms of delivery, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we're going to be relying on the Thames Gateway to deliver 100,000 homes a year. It's just not going to happen. It'll deliver some, but certainly in addition to housing, the commercial bit of it and then the leisure will only come, I think, when locations that are closer to London, that have had the Olympic factor, have been exhausted.
I mean, you can't say this, but I will. It's a bit off pitch for land security, really, wasn't it? Actually,
I think one of the reasons I'm a little bit sceptical about this garden cities as a solution is how they get funded as well, and partly to what you're saying there, about the lead time. if you're LNG and you want to build 10,000 homes, let's say, and we've got a pipeline of 27,000, so that's not off the scale. If you want to build 10,000 homes in new settlements, would you choose A, 10 urban extensions of 1,000 units each, or B, one town of 10,000? And given the upfront costs, the time frame, the planning complexity, the infrastructure requirement, then maybe it won't happen. You know, it's for me, it's very easy to decide between those two options. Now, I'm not saying that's the right answer for UK, because we end up with urban sprawl potentially, and I know that needs controlling, but it is difficult to make sense of the funding model for very big new towns. It's not easy.
And rely on it for any sort of significant scale. I think
scale, and how long do you take before you get some sort of payback? I mean, you know, some of the new towns I've looked at, we've looked at the number, you might get your first bit of money out 10, 15 years from now. And then there's another 10 years beyond that for it to be fully... So it's difficult. It's just very difficult. Very long-term time frame.
And I think you have to go back to why and when it's been done successfully in the past. It's only ever happened where it was local authority led and where land values were diddly squat. You know, it just cannot achieve it at sufficient scale otherwise.
Just a couple of points on that. I think there's a new Ebbsfleet Development Corporation or something being set up probably by next March. I've spoken to Michael Cassidy, who's chairing it now, and he says the vital question is transport, still vital. And he doesn't just mean, he means extending Crossrail down an already secured route into Ebbsfleet, and also getting cheap fares and getting Ebbsfleet into the Oyster card. He said things like that make a difference, and that's what he's pushing for at the moment. And the other thing, of course, is this rather strange scheme to build a £2 billion entertainment resort on the Sconscombe Peninsula seems to be less lunatic than I thought it was. I've met the people involved with it now, and they are spending £40 million getting planning permission. They are huge sums of money being poured into this over the next year in order to go straight to the planning inspectorate for planning permission if they've got some sort of special status. So that area seems to me, at least, to be got a bit more about it than it had, say, when Mascot is brought in 2003 or 4. Thamesmead is also being looked at very closely by Peabody. There's a new master plan for Thamesmead happening. The Crossrail is opening there. It just seems that area is sort of come about.
I think it's a pattern across London, driven in part by value considerations. So, for example, we're working on a scheme in West London, which is a Crossrail scheme around Hayes Station. Clients acquired the land some years ago, standing investment. But with the Crossrail opening in 2018, they can see the development happening. The local authority is changing the whole development plan around the station within a 800-metre distance to create new neighbourhoods, new quarters, new districts. It's working through the planning system. But off the back of that, values which were at £300-400 and developments viable, suddenly when people in central London are talking about ridiculous values, suddenly these locations in Greater London start to become affordable and in reach. And I think that's also driving greater interest back into some of these schemes off the back of public transport. Hayes will be 18 minutes to Bond Street when Crossrail opens. And suddenly a 40-minute commute from that distance now, you suddenly think, well, actually, in 3 years' time, I can do it in 20 minutes. And I think that's the sort of level of transformational change, which is why I think Boris came out saying he thinks Crossrail 2 is going to be important to London. You know, all these routes that will just open up and regenerate parts of outer London. So I think it's a combination of the crazy prices in central London and the relative affordability of some of these locations.
Another question from the audience? Yes.
I'm Philip Barnes, the Group Land Director for Barratt Developments. I just want to agree entirely with Bill about just managing our expectations about how the extent to which garden cities can solve an immediate crisis. We're a full supporter of them, but they do present some huge return on capital challenges for the largest house builder in the country. But on the point, if we are looking at garden cities, I mean, just a question to the panel. On the land value uplift, isn't it just a question of primary legislation that Nick talked about in France? I mean, when the new towns were delivered, there was an act, there was lending from the government, quite chunky interest rates, by the way, and the land was bought at agricultural value. What we then had through the 60s and 70s was a series of case law on hope value that said the state cannot do that. You cannot buy, I cannot buy his site for housing and tell him I'm buying it for agricultural. The case laws establish that. But primary legislation could surely solve that.
To remove that, to remove the hope value thing. Do you
In
mean?
case law, and we could just say, I mean, for example, Emma's point, if you had a national plan, plus housing, garden cities come through the NSIP process, you have a plan, you have a delivery, you have some lending, you have some legislation. I don't see it's that different.
Does the New Towns Act still in force?
It is, but it's been superseded by case law. That's
I see.
That's the way the system works in Britain, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Any comments from the panel on that?
Feels like something's got to happen, doesn't it? I mean, certainly housing, I think I said earlier, is at last a cross-party issue. So there needs to be, or there will be, I think, some consensus on the problem. And one would think, maybe not for Greenbelt, because I agree that's probably a step too far, but a solution that can be generated that will do that. And new towns, I think, is an interesting way of doing it, because you do get, with the new towns, you get the advantage of low land values, you get local authority led, and maybe back to Wahid's point, some involvement from the private sector and some sort of JV development management type arrangement, that there could be something in that.
But would it be, I mean, just a quick one. I talked to somebody who put an application into the Wolfson Prize for the towns, and their application went in, and he said, Peter, I want you to look at the last 5 pages of this application. And it had letters in there from a certain agent, and he said, the trouble we had getting the government to understand that you could buy land at agricultural value, their models are based upon the hope value thing, not on the agricultural land value. And they had to have several meetings with senior government officials to persuade them that their model works. And the only reason it works is because it works on agricultural land values, not on the hope values, which up until that point the government thought they had to use, because they're thinking of extensions to towns as opposed to it. Is it not just as simple as trying to get rid of extinguishing that hope value thing and going back to the New Town Corporation stuff? Small Act of Parliament. Is there any lawyers who would like to comment on?
I just say 2 points. I mean, I think one, that still wouldn't get away with the cash flow issue, because you're still going to have to put a substantial amount of investment into the infrastructure, regardless of however you do it. I think where you've seen some successful examples of things where it's been joint ventures, shared joint ventures with public sector and private sector, sharing the risk and sharing the reward, and that's, there's almost a point where you've got to incentivise the landowner to sell. And okay, you get from one extreme, which is hope value, but you've got to give them an incentive, and assuming they're selling at agricultural value is no incentive at all. So there is somewhere in between where I think that our system could work, but you're still never going to get around. And I think the point, we've looked at similar schemes, cash flow is a major problem on front loading. Unless the public sector are going to step in to front load some of that early investment infrastructure, it becomes still very, very challenging to do.
There are infrastructure funds knocking around, aren't there, that can do this sort of thing?
They are.
Be set up to do this.
Yeah, a lot of them are quite hungry for income.
Yeah.
I think to contemplate what's required in a lot of these situations, and it's probably true down at Ebbsfleet, is a number of billions of zero coupon investment for a period of time just to kick off. Yeah. That's against the background of no planning risk and with a very supportive either central or local government, and that's not so easy for infrastructure funds to do.
Okay.
Because of the income.
Yeah. None for the first 15 years, I suppose. Okay, another question, please, from the audience. Can. Anybody else? Michael, yes.
Just picking up on the comment that was made regarding the sort of consenting regime and the possibility of using the NSIP system where you're consenting major infrastructure projects. I think a lot of people were surprised perhaps that large new towns or settlements weren't drawn into that regime, because particularly where a number of them rely on land within a number of boroughs, which is always politically challenging. I think the Conservatives, the coalition, said that was offside because it didn't square with localism. But I just wonder, the other option, of course, is the Development Corporation. I mean, that's a significant factor on the Olympic deficit, that there has been a mayoral development corporation there to bring the boroughs together. And I just wonder if the panel, perhaps Bill's enthusiasm for garden cities might be increased if the consenting regime was simplified and actually had a bit more certainty and speed to it.
In concept, without question, yes, they're important issues. In concept, I think, the deliverability is the question. Is there a political party that's willing to make that happen? I think for me, in a way, one of the problems about talking about these things 7 or 8 months, whatever it is, before a general election is there's a lot of talking, a lot of positioning, a lot of politicising. And actually, what you really need to know is that after May, there's some actions off the back of that.
I think the interesting thing about the NSIP is that it might widen the net of operators who are prepared to take it on. I think the trouble with garden cities or urban extensions is that they are, forget sort of cash flowing the actual delivery of them, just processing them and getting the show on the road is not for the faint-hearted. The cash involved in master planning these things, getting it through the planning process, before you've even put a spade in the ground, prohibits so many people getting involved, not to mention the process. So if there were a more certain outcome, I suppose, and investors and developers could manage their risk, more proactively through, some assurity that there was a finite period of time to this process, there was a degree of certainty of outcome, you might well find there are a greater number of people prepared to invest, and that might be advantageous. I think too long, there's too few people trying to peddle too few sites, and the whole thing just takes too long.
I got it wrong. Isn't that what the Kuwaitis are doing in Swansea?
Not for housing though. That's a leisure project. I think what Michael's saying is that why couldn't that sort of process be used for housing developments?
Yes.
And I think that would attract more people into the.
Michael Barrett's nodding very enthusiastically at this moment. Okay.
We've got a major new settlement proposal which we think, what the hell do we do with it? We're actually considering going through NSIP just for the infrastructure and the commercial elements.
Yeah.
Because you get a planning decision after 12 months. I mean, that is just failure of the system, surely.
Yeah. So NSIP allows you to, it has a timetable in it, does it?
It's a guaranteed 12 months decision on the plan. There's a lead. It took at least 6 months to lead into it. There's a lot of pre-app.
Yeah.
But you've got, I'm not saying we're definitely going to do it. We've got the biggest house builder in the country saying we're going to go for a major scheme.
Yeah.
We have, because of the law, we have to take the housing out to get permission for our housing scheme.
Yeah.
I mean, that isn't sensible.
It is a bit sad.
The man on the moon wouldn't say that's right.
Yeah. Okay, well, the guys at Swanscombe are convinced that their £2 billion resort will open in May 2020 because they're putting their planning application in next winter.
Really?
Yeah. I know they're from Kuwait. Perhaps they don't understand how things work here, but that's what they're saying. That's what they're saying. Okay, yes, sir, man at the back.
Thank you. Alan Perkins, Aurora Properties. Nick, you mentioned planning by appeal earlier as a mechanism that's occurred through the failure to have a 5-year housing supply. Yet Eric Pickles has made it fairly clear recently that green belt sites will be treated differently. The failure to have a 5-year housing supply plan will not satisfy the test on very special circumstances. In the National Planning Policy Framework, a few paragraphs later, it talks about local authorities removing land in exceptional circumstances. Can you tell me your take on the difference between very special circumstances and exceptional circumstances?
The statement on the 6th of October clarifying the MPPG is that the requirement on a local authority to have in place an objective assessment of need for housing I think points been made already, we're in panic mode before the election because with localism, it wasn't supposed to be like this. Communities felt they'd be empowered, they wouldn't have development imposed upon them, and they thought they could resist development. Of course, now with Pickles and the 5-year housing land supply card being played time and time again, including getting permission for sites in the Greenbelt, communities have got frustrated. So we've had a couple of quick ministerial statements, 2 from Bowles, 1 from Pickles, saying, actually, we didn't really mean that. If you look at the little footnote below paragraph 14 on the NPPF, it lists all the various sites, and the Greenbelt's on there. And they've said, no, you've all been misunderstanding. 5-year housing land supply doesn't necessarily trump these other things. It's all material consideration back into the melting pot of every planning application determined on its relative merits. And I think where authorities then started to get themselves into a bit of a lather, following the Solihull case, following the Harrogate inspector advising the authorities going to find their plan unsound because they didn't have an objective assessment of need, they're saying, right, we'll now just undertake reviews of our housing needs, and that means also undertaking Greenbelt reviews. And again, panicking about what that really means, he's issued a statement to say, no, just clarifying, it's just one of a number of considerations. So you can, if you want to, use the OAN card to support a Greenbelt review if you want to, but it all depends on the circumstances. So it's a complete fudge until after the election. And my own personal view is we'll come back after the election, and then they'll all say, we're even further adrift of our housing targets. You can all have Greenbelt reviews if you want them. And Mole Valley, for example, immediately post a statement have abandoned their Greenbelt review. Others are ploughing on with their Greenbelt review. Elmbridge have just started because they've said, we're not prepared to wait. We're going to get ourselves into difficulty because the 5-year housing land supply card is going to get pulled out again. So we don't want to have development in an unsustained, unplanned way. We want to be proactive and have development where we want it. And if that means Greenbelt review, we'll take the difficult decision of Greenbelt review. So unfortunately, there is no right answer, there's no obvious and easy answer to your question. I think, unfortunately, Pickles' statement is yet another fudge. And I do think the 3 statements that have come out this year haven't particularly helped in the strategic land supporting development plans. You can interpret it any which way you can, and some authorities are running for cover, and some authorities are sticking with their reviews and persevering and just see what happens the other side of the election.
All sounds very familiar. Right, another question from the audience? We've got a few minutes left. Yes.
Ian Fletcher from the British Property Federation. Slightly different direction, but the government seems to have started to sort of rediscover brownfield housing development, is creating housing zones, putting a bit of money into those, and promoting things like local development ordinance. Interested in the panel's view as to are we doing enough, is the government doing enough to promote brownfield development?
That's not very easy. You'll be sitting there very quietly. You can answer.
As the local authority who decided not to bid for a housing zone, I think the issues, I'm not a big fan of the whole housing zone, to be honest with you. I think the issue is that local authorities and a range of partners need a bit more capacity. So if you take just the Greater Birmingham housing market, the City Council has just started building houses again. For the first time after many years, we just started on site for 1,000 homes this year alone. We're trying to encourage the RSLs, we're trying to encourage the private sector. You need a combination of providers, all to increase their capacity, all working, trying to chip away at the figure. Some of the housing zones, the fact that you lose the ability to contribute to schools or to contribute to public transport, this is the very reason why communities are so against any new development, even within brownfield. We have a housing need in most areas. In Birmingham, I need 35% of all housing to be affordable. So you go into a housing zone, and someone builds 100 homes, none of them will be affordable. And now that means the next site I've got, which is 100, I need 70 homes out of the 100 coming to be affordable. So actually, I think it's another knee-jerk reaction to supporting the capacity. The simple thing they could do for local authorities is lift the cap on borrowing on the housing revenue accounts. We'd increase borrowing to build more homes, supporting the RSLs. I think there's a range of other interventions. Incentivising, New Homes Bonus was given to local authorities some years ago to incentivise development. I think
that hasn't worked at all.
The reality is it's a very small amount of money per home. Unless you're a small district council, it makes very little difference on your balance sheet. for new homes bonus, and it's fairly open. You can use it for any funding, even that they encourage you to use it for housing. It's fairly broad in how it's done.
Are you building 1,000 council homes or 1,000 homes to sell?
Actually, we've gone into housing market areas on brownfield sites within the city where developers wouldn't generally go. So Birmingham, for example, Handsworth, where most of the riots started off in the 1980s, we worked very hard with a lot of the house builders to say, come and build homes in Handsworth. And they just said, there's no housing market, we're not taking the risks. So we decided we set up our own development company. We went in, did a land assembly.
How do you
hopefully,
what do you do? CPO the land?
No, we owned some of the land. We then did some voluntary acquisitions, created a development plot. It was convenient because I granted ourselves planning permission, which was helpful. And actually, we sold out of the 250 homes, 190 off plan. The level of return I've made on that for the city, we're now actually becoming a major house builder, which is great.
So these 1,000 are for sale, are they?
Well, this mixed, because actually I don't want to just have for sale, so I've got for sale, plus for rent, and some affordable. And actually now I've got developers queuing up saying, have you got any sites in Handsworth? We don't want to go into the more affluent areas, just selling off plan. The reason why it's common sense, no one's built a house in that area for 20 years.
Density?
Density is 40 per hectare.
And
I think that. To be honest with you, we've got to push up the density because we've now had land supply. I can't argue for increasing building on Greenbelt and then start to build at 30 per hectare. It becomes incredibly difficult for us to do. And in the right locations, city centre locations, on the right transport corridors, you can develop higher densities and it can be done properly.
How high are you going?
We've got successful schemes in Birmingham, over 120 per hectare in the city centre.
Up in the air.
Oh, we only go 3 or 4 stories, so we don't. The townhouses is what we principally build in suburban locations.
Okay. All right. I think we've got time for one more question, if anybody has one. Would like to ask something particularly nasty at the end here? We haven't had it. Rosie, you can ask.
It's not nasty. I'm Rosie. I work for Argent, build at King's Cross and other things. I just want to ask, this kind of best practice, how are you feeding that back into sort of central government and other local authorities and regions? It seems like you've got really amazing ideas and we're all nodding our heads. How does that get translated? How do you help out, share the...
Some of it, so we were part of the Lines Review, so I was involved in the Lines Review. So quite a few of the recommendations that came out of the Lines Review came from Birmingham. They came into the Lines and the team come and spent a day with us. I'm involved in some of the CLG, sounding boards, etc. And a lot of events like this. There is no other formal process, to be honest with you. I end up doing a lot of this down in London. I spend more time here than I do in Birmingham. That's probably because of all the Greenbelt release I'm advocating at the moment, to be honest. But it's been out trying to share some of that experience and also learn some of the experience.
You seem to have found ways round things, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and many of you have heard me speak before, when I'm not the biggest fan of the planning system. That's ironic, being the Chief Planning Officer for Birmingham. But we found that some of the process and master plans can be so cumbersome to get development progressing. My own experience, MG Rover collapsed, and we did an area action plan. It took me 4.5 years. By the time I adopted the plan, the housing market, the market crashed, and actually everything I put in the plan suddenly was no longer viable. So in 2010, we did a big C plan. It wasn't an SPD, it wasn't an AEP. We did a master plan and said, forget whether it follows the planning process. We're going to do what's right for the area, and actually articulate to the private sector what we want for development in that locality. And 4 years since we've adopted the plan, apart from every lawyer writing to me telling me that I've not followed process and they're going to jail me, 4 years on, we've approved all of our decisions consistent with the plan, and I've not lost a single appeal. Now, I think that's fairly good. I mean, even if I lost 5%, I still would have been happy, but we've lost none. And basically, because the private sector want you to articulate what you want. It's simple, and if they like what you want and you're clear, they'll come and do investment. If they don't, they'll go elsewhere. Most of the private sector don't come into the cities and say, let's take on the city for an appeal. If they know that's what we want to have, then they'll work with us, and if they don't like it, they'll go elsewhere. Yeah. It's what happens in cities. Localities are not clear what they want. Private sector's invested so far, and then therefore they have to fight the authority because they've invested too much into there. And it's been a great success for us in Birmingham.
Okay. Wahid, well done, and thank you very much, everybody, for your patience. And can you just give the panel a good...